Age of revolutions. I'd like to make one announcement before we get started with the notes. I would like your checkpoint questions to be answered on a separate sheet of paper for this set of video notes because I am going to collect it. So once again, I am collecting your checkpoint questions. So in order to effectively study for your final while I have the questions, it would be a good idea to write your questions separate from your notes and not in a notebook. Okay, first of all, what is a revolution? We talked about this a little bit in class today, but just to be more specific, a revolution is a fundamental change in power or organizational structures that takes place in a relatively short period of time. Think about the scientific revolution. That was a revolution in thought rather than in political power, but it created this drastic change in a pretty short period of time. So the Enlightenment can also be considered a revolution in thought, but two political revolutions come directly from the ideas of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution and the American Revolution. Now, you should be pretty familiar with the American Revolution, and I know we talked about this during the Socratic seminar, but the Enlightenment gave rise to this idea that colonialism was no longer just. Taxation without representation meant that people were not having fair say in their government and the decisions that were being made. So the American Revolution, basically, long story short, they overthrow the British, so America is no longer governed by a king. So the British still have their king, but now we need to create our own government. So first they write the Declaration of Independence to officially declare our independence from Britain, and that was in 1776. So then the Revolutionary War occurred, and remember, one of these Enlightenment ideals that we find in the Declaration of Independence is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They also need to create a constitution after they finally win the war, which includes a Bill of Rights, which is based on Enlightenment principles. So specifically, the Enlightenment principles that our Constitution is built around is from John Locke, life, liberty, and property, turns into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. That's where Thomas Jefferson got it. Montesquieu contributed to our government by giving the idea of separation of powers, so those three branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, and that they all check and balance each other, and that there also is a separation between church and state. The head of the church is not the same as the head of state or the head of government. And Voltaire contributed to those First Amendment rights, such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. So we won the war. We built a democracy successfully out of the chains of a colonial monarchy, or an absolute monarchy. So we set this example that this could be done. So the success of the American Revolution inspired global movements all around the world, the most immediate of which was the French Revolution. So we talked a little bit about this in class today, but just to go into more detail, since the Middle Ages, France's population has been divided into 3 estates. This is known as the Ancien regime. And remember, that means like old regime. So the first estate consisted of the clergy, the second estate consisted of the nobles, and the third estate, everyone from the lowliest peasant to the wealthiest merchant. So peasants, people who were farmers, city workers, bourgeoisie, so wealthy merchants. These people did not have any rights, really. It was mostly the first and second estate who got rights, but they did have representation in the estates general. This was known, like I said previously, as the Ancien regime, which means old regime. If you look at the root word of ancien, ancient, right? So this was an absolute monarchy that benefited from the massive absolute centralization of government and from the 3-estate system. So the French Revolution took place from 1789 to 1799. A little background here. In 1783, King Louis XVI ruled on the throne of the Ancien regime, and he was the absolute monarch. So he was pretty hated by his citizens, as was his wife, Marie Antoinette. The structure of the 3 estates, there were great inequalities in French society, and many people did not have power or access to government. Even though they technically had representation, the number of people that the third estate was responsible for was so much greater than the first two estates. So they could only represent so much of those people. So King Louis created a lot of debt by helping the Americans beat Britain, which caused the government serious troubles. That was that bankruptcy thing that we talked about, because they kind of bailed us as Americans out to defeat their rivals, the British. They were left in a ton of debt. So because of this and this conflict that he could feel brewing in his government, Louis called a meeting of the Estates General on May 5th, 1789, to try to solve the money problem. So he thought he'd get all the representatives of government together to try and solve this problem and come up with a solution. So what happens is the third estate hears of this conspiracy that they're going to get locked out of this Estates General meeting. So they decide to go to a nearby tennis court, and they form the National Assembly. So this established a limited monarchy, and they drafted the Constitution of 1791. They outnumbered the first two states put together, and their representation seriously outnumbered those first two estates. So they modeled their Constitution after the newly established United States and those Enlightenment ideals. They proclaimed that all men were free and equal before the law, that the appointment to public office should be based on talent, not hereditary, and that no group should be exempt from taxation. It began with the natural and imprescriptible rights of man to liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. So similarly to the American Revolution, they guaranteed certain rights that came directly from the Enlightenment. Again, they guaranteed freedom of speech, and freedom of the press. And liberty, equality, and fraternity, which means brotherhood, fraternity means brotherhood, became the new slogan for the revolution. So they still had a king after the National Assembly, but a legislative assembly of 745 representatives would make the laws, rather than about the 1,200 Estates General representatives who represented different classes within society. So this was also different from the Estates General because everyone had equal rights, but again, only wealthy men were allowed to vote. So if you didn't own land, you couldn't vote. Louis XVI obviously objected to this because this limits his power, but ultimately he had no choice but to accept the Constitution or he would be violently overthrown. So if he wanted to maintain any power at all, he had to be flexible and accept the National Assembly. Checkpoint number 1. And remember, these are on a separate sheet of paper. The next phase in the French Revolution is the National Convention. In September of 1792, this National Convention met to make another constitution, but they wanted to end the monarchy, so this was without Louis XVI. Most of these people who met at the National Convention were lawyers, professionals, and other property owners. The leading group was known as the Jacobins. On January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette were beheaded by the guillotine. And that is not guillotine, it's guillotine. So that was that blade that they release the rope and it chops off your head. So the king had not accepted the National Convention, so he got his head chopped off by the radical, violent group of the Jacobins who start this thing that eventually turns into what's known as the Reign of Terror. So this is the more violent or radical stage. Radical means extreme. Other European countries became fearful of this radical stage, and they feared that the revolutionary spirit and those Enlightenment thoughts in this violent form would overthrow those absolute monarchies elsewhere in Europe and would spread to their own countries. So these other European countries begin to send troops into France to stop the revolution. So within France, the revolution had opposition, but also externally, internationally, other countries were fighting against the revolutionaries because their own king couldn't fight for them anymore. So a leader named Maximilien Robespierre, who we will just refer to as Robespierre, becomes the leader of the National Convention, and he forms this Committee of Public Safety in order to combat the invading armies and the dissent, which means disagreement, from within France. So any opposition within France would be subject to the Committee of Public Safety as well as those invading armies. So Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety lead a 12-month reign of terror against all who opposed the revolution. So no matter who you were, if you were not pro-revolutionary, then you would be subject to violence, torture, killing by the Committee of Public Safety. So anyone who is pro-monarchy and anti-revolutionary. Across France, 40,000 people lost their lives to the guillotine, and the public was encouraged to watch and learn from these executions. So the guillotine would be in the center of town, and they would come out and chop off people's heads for their crimes and teach other citizens how to be more pro-revolutionary and less pro-monarchy. This reign of terror ended in 1795 when Robespierre himself was executed and for being too violent, basically, and more moderate leaders took power. These moderate leaders were known as the bourgeoisie, that's where the word bougie comes from, and they were upper middle class. So that's what bourgeoisie means, and that's where that term derives from. Checkpoint number 2. Okay, so the bourgeoisie forms this new constitution in 1795, and it's more moderate and placed power in the hands of the upper class. So they thought, okay, people are getting a little crazy in the lower classes. We would need to consolidate that power back up to people who are educated and knowledgeable, and this becomes known as the Directory. So the Directory features a bicameral legislature, which means it has 2 chambers. So like we have a House and a Senate, but they just had 2 chambers, and a 5-man executive committee. That would be more like our executive branch. In 1799, the Directory appoints General Napoleon Bonaparte as leader of the executive committee. So basically, this general started rising up in the ranks because France was at war, so Napoleon grew famous that way. And then by 1802, Napoleon forms his own government by seizing power through a coup d'etat, which means overthrowing the government, and he declares himself Emperor of France. So France and the bourgeoisie and the Directory are no longer the form of government in France. As emperor, Napoleon signs peace treaties with Austria, Russia, and Great Britain, but then proceeds to spread his empire throughout Europe. So he also restores the French relationship with the Catholic Church. This helped him grow his empire, and he conquered and spread nationalism across the continent. So not only did people take up to this ideal of democracy, but also that their own country was the best country. This ultimately becomes his downfall when other nationalist groups come and want to take him over. So after a disastrous invasion of Russia, other European nations attacked Napoleon's army and captured Paris. Napoleon was exiled from France, and he died in exile, and the monarchy was eventually restored in France, and Louis XVIII becomes the next king. There are many more revolutions in France. This is the first one that established a democratic republic of France, but they flip back and forth between monarchy and republic. Right now, they are what's known as the Fifth Republic. That's how many times in the last 250 years, pretty much, it has flip-flopped back and forth. But the important thing for this time period is the Reign of Terror and Napoleon. Okay, checkpoint number 3, and then you are done.